I told the Mafia boss my mother had that same ring. I never expected the Mafia boss to freeze. The heavy iron gate of the Bellini estate had barely closed behind me when I said the sentence that changed both of our lives forever. I was standing in a sunlit study at the edge of Cleveland, my leather satchel of appraisal tools balanced on my forearm, and I was looking at a worn black onyx ring on the right hand of a 53-year-old Mafia boss I had never met before that morning. My voice was calm, professional, almost gentle. "My mother owned a ring identical to that one," I said. "She kept it in a drawer beside her wedding photograph for 29 years. Renzo Bellini did not move. He did not blink. For a long moment, he did not even breathe. The silver light from the window caught the ring, caught his face, and turned both of us into something colder than stone. Somewhere behind me, a heavy oak door clicked shut, and I suddenly understood that I had walked into a room I might not be allowed to walk out of. I was 29 years old, an estate jewelry specialist from Vermilion, Ohio, and until that morning my most dangerous professional problem had been a mislabeled Edwardian brooch. I had been called to the Bellini estate to authenticate a small collection of inherited pieces, nothing more. A polite housekeeper had led me upstairs. A polite steward had offered me coffee. A polite man in a charcoal suit had walked in, extended his hand, and greeted me by name. Everything about the morning had been polite. Then I had noticed the ring on his index finger, and 30 years of Bellini history had cracked open like glass. I had recognized the piece the way an old teacher recognizes a former student. Same weight, same shadow of a scratch across the onyx, same tiny nick in the gold above where a woman's thumb had rested for decades. I had not meant to say anything. The sentence had walked out of my mouth by itself, the way honest sentences sometimes do, and now there was no calling it back. Renzo lowered his hand slowly to the desk. His eyes did not leave my face. "Say that again, Miss Hart." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a room that had gone very still. My mouth went dry. I had spent enough years around powerful clients to recognize when a small remark had become an emergency. "My mother," I repeated, steadier than I felt. "Elaine Hart. She had a ring exactly like that one. Same weight, same onyx, same carved rim. She never told me where it came from." Renzo studied me for what felt like an eternity. Then very carefully he asked, "Where is that ring now?" I hesitated, because the honest answer sounded like something out of a bad film. "In a safe deposit box at a small bank in Vermilion. It belongs to me now. She died 3 years ago, and I have never taken it out. If you already feel the air in that room tighten, do me one small favor. Tap the like button and subscribe before we go any further, because what happens over the next hour is going to test everything you believe about loyalty, family, and the secrets our mothers carried to the grave. Now, back to Cleveland." Renzo stood up so slowly that his chair did not make a sound. He walked to the window, hands folded behind his back, and for a moment he looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man reading a letter he had been waiting 30 years to receive. When he turned around, his expression was unreadable, but his voice was almost kind. "I would like you to stay at the estate for a few days, Miss Hart, under my protection. I will pay you 5 times your standard rate for the inconvenience." I opened my mouth to refuse. Renzo raised one finger gently. "It is not a request I am comfortable phrasing as a demand," he said. "But it is not entirely a request either. There are 3 rings like this one in the world. Or there were, until you walked into my house. I was given a guest suite on the 2nd floor, a suite that smelled of cedar and lemon polish, and had a small brass lock on the inside of the door that would not have stopped a determined child. I did not sleep that first night. I sat on the edge of the bed with my mother's photograph in my lap and tried to reconstruct a woman I now realized I had never fully known. Elaine Hart had been an emergency room nurse in a modest Ohio lakeside town. She had raised me alone in a small house with a screened porch. She had baked banana bread on Sundays and cried during weather reports about hurricanes she had never seen. She had also, apparently, once owned a ring worn by a man who ran half of Cleveland, and she had died at 61 with that secret still folded inside her. And I realized now that every question I had never asked her had suddenly become a debt I was going to have to pay. The first test came on the second morning, and it came from the woman I would learn to fear most in that house. Marcella Bellini was 59, Renzo's older sister, widowed for 11 years and dressed permanently in the muted grays of a person who had decided that grief was a wardrobe. She entered the appraisal room with a soft smile and a heavy velvet tray. "My brother wants your professional opinion on these before you leave," she said. "Take your time. The insurance schedules are in the folder." I worked slowly and honestly for 4 hours. When I opened the folder to cross-reference the pieces, I found the inventory listed 12 items. I counted 13 on my tray. The extra was a Georgian mourning pendant worth more than my car. I did not touch it. I did not photograph it. I did not slip it into my satchel to test my theory. I took a pen, a sheet of Bellini stationery, and I wrote in neat block letters, "Extra item not on Invino. Location, Tray C. Witnessed at 11:14 a.m. I sealed the pendant separately in a padded envelope, wrote the same words on the outside, and walked it downstairs myself. Marcella happened to be in the front hall, which of course was not an accident. I handed her the envelope, calmly, in front of the housekeeper and 2 of Renzo's men. "There is an unlisted piece in the collection," I said. "You will want to update your schedule before I continue." Marcella's smile did not move. Her eyes did. She thanked me and walked away, and by the time I returned to the appraisal room, I understood exactly what had just happened. And I knew that if I wanted to leave that house on my own terms, I would have to stop being surprised. Renzo found me at the window an hour later. He did not apologize. He did not pretend not to know. He simply said, "You have my sister's attention, Miss Hart. I would prefer you also had her respect. That may take longer." I did not answer immediately. I was watching a large dog limp slowly across the lawn below, a great gray mastiff with cloudy eyes and a stiff back leg. Renzo followed my gaze and something in his face softened for the first time. "Mercer," he said, 13 years old. My wife rescued him the year before she died. He does not like strangers, but he tolerates me on his good days." That evening, I saw Renzo Bellini crouched on the cold flagstones of a back terrace, feeding boiled chicken by hand to an arthritic dog. He talked to Mercer the way a patient man talks to a frightened child, slow and low and without hurry. He canceled a meeting that Marcella clearly considered important because the dog would not eat unless Renzo sat beside him. He kept a folded blanket under his own knee to protect Mercer's joint from the stone. I watched from the library window for almost an hour, and by the time I turned away I had understood something that Marcella Bellini had spent decades refusing to see. Renzo was not gentle because it was useful. He was gentle because, underneath the empire, he had never stopped being it. I had spent my working life reading the small marks that men leave on the things they love. A watch with a smoothed crown, a locket with a worn hinge. The way Renzo's thumb rested against the dog's ear told me more about him than any file Marcella could ever have compiled. And I realized, standing at that library window, that the danger of a man like Renzo Bellini was not that he could kill you. The danger was that he could make you want to be seen by him. The second test was smarter than the first. 2 days later, I overheard Marcella speaking in the corridor, apparently unaware that the appraisal room door was open. A shipment, a warehouse near the lake, a window of 2 hours on Thursday night. I noted the details automatically, the way I noted a hallmark or a carat weight, and I did not think about them again until a soft-spoken man in an ordinary jacket approached me outside a coffee shop the next afternoon. He introduced himself as a broker representing a rival interest. He offered me $40,000 in cash for what I had overheard. He was polite. He was patient. He knew exactly how much medical debt my mother had left behind, and he mentioned it once, gently, the way a doctor mentions a diagnosis. I did not take the money. I also did not immediately go to Renzo. I sat in my car for 20 minutes and thought, very carefully, about the geometry of the trap. Marcella had let me hear that conversation. Someone had told the broker where to find me. That someone knew the corridor was open. That someone knew my schedule. That someone lived inside the Bellini estate. And that someone was not merely testing whether I was a thief. that someone was testing whether I was clever enough to be dangerous. When I finally drove back through the iron gates, I went straight to Renzo's study, closed the door behind me and said, "I am being tested from inside your house, and whoever is doing it is not only testing me, they are testing you." Renzo listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." I stared at him. "You knew." "I suspected after the first test. I was certain after the second." He rose, walked to a small cabinet, and poured 2 glasses of water, not wine. He handed me one. "Miss Hart, I am going to ask you to do something that is neither safe nor entirely fair. I am going to ask you to keep letting them test you, and I am going to ask you to let me appear to believe them." I set my glass down. "You want me to be bait?" "I want you to be my partner," he said quietly. "The bait is only the surface of it. Whoever is doing this has been in my house longer than my sister has been suspicious of you. I need them to feel safe enough to make a mistake." I was quiet for a moment. I thought about my mother, who had lived in fear of quiet men in expensive suits her entire adult life, and who had left a ring in a drawer that her daughter would one day carry into their house anyway. I thought about the fact that I had 2 choices, and only one of them let me walk out of the Bellini estate the same person I had walked into it. "I have one condition," I said. "If we do this, you tell me nothing you would not tell a partner. Not to protect me, not to spare me. If I am going to be the one they measure, I need to see the ruler." Renzo looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has just given away something he did not know he still had to give. That was the moment, though neither of us said it aloud, that a quiet and dangerous alliance began. From the outside, the household began to curdle. Renzo grew colder toward me in front of the staff. He asked pointed questions about my mother in tones that suggested he was no longer sure of the answers. He limited my access to certain rooms. He told Marcella, within earshot of 2 guards known to gossip, that he had begun to wonder if the young appraiser had brought a great deal more into his home than an inventory list. Marcella's shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. She believed her brother was finally listening. She was, of course, being listened to herself, by someone patient enough to have waited 30 years for exactly this shift in the wind. Marcella sent me, alone, to visit an 84-year-old retired jeweler named Gideon Voss. The pretext was research on the ring's provenance. The real purpose, I understood at once, was to see whether I would bully an old man for information. Gideon lived above his shuttered shop on a narrow street where the wind smelled of lake and iron. He greeted me with the wary courtesy of a man who had outlived most of his customers. He served me tea from a cracked porcelain pot. He would not, at first, discuss the rings at all. He asked me about my work. He asked me about my mother's kitchen. He asked me twice whether I had walked to his shop alone. We had been speaking for perhaps 20 minutes when a stranger knocked at the shop door below and, without waiting for an answer, let himself in with a key that Gideon had clearly never given him. The man was heavy-set, professionally polite, and he had brought papers. He wanted Gideon to sign the shop over as collateral against a debt Gideon insisted he did not owe. I stood up before Gideon could. I placed myself quite deliberately between the old man and the stranger, and I said in the same steady voice I had used with Renzo on the first morning, "I am Mr. Voss's guest. Any conversation about his property will happen in the presence of his attorney. You may leave your card." I was not tall. I was not armed. I was a jewelry appraiser in flat shoes. But something in my tone made the stranger fold his papers back into his coat and go without another word. Gideon sat down slowly after the door closed. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "Your mother was Elaine Hart." My breath caught. "Yes. I made her ring." His hands trembled slightly around the teacup. "I made all of them, but I have kept a promise for 30 years and I will keep it a little longer." Before I left, he stopped me at the door. His eyes were very tired but very clear. "Miss Hart," he said, "listen carefully. The number everyone remembers is wrong." I asked what he meant. He shook his head. "You will understand when you are ready to, not before." I drove back to the estate in a daze. I did not yet know how to place Gideon's sentence into the puzzle. What I did know was that Marcella's trap had failed again, and that somewhere in the house, someone patient was beginning to run out of patience. I could feel it the way a nurse feels a fever rising through a wrist before any thermometer confirms it. I thought about my mother's hands as I drove. Elaine Hart had had the calm, careful hands of a woman who could open a stranger's chest at 3 a.m. and close it again in time for breakfast. She had never spoken about the ring in the drawer. She had never spoken about Cleveland at all. And I understood, for the first time, that the silence had not been forgetfulness. It had been protection. My mother had spent her adult life folding a dangerous piece of history into the smallest possible shape. And now that shape was unfolding in my lap on a highway outside a city she had never once agreed to visit. That someone was Renzo's godfather. Tomas Rinaldi was 76 years old, silver-haired, courtly in the manner of a man who had memorized every etiquette book his mother owned. He had advised Renzo's father before Renzo was born. He had held Renzo at his baptism. He had stood at Renzo's mother's funeral with his hand on the boy's shoulder while the boy did not cry. He appeared at the estate now for occasional dinners, gave Marcella soft counsel in the sunroom, and pressed her hand between both of his when he took his leave. He never raised his voice. He rarely gave an order that could be traced. He did not lie, not exactly. He told Marcella only what would cause her to do what he wanted her to do next, and he let her fill in the rest with the fear she had been feeding for a decade. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, this is the moment I want to ask you something. When you were a child, did you ever look at an older relative and feel absolutely safe with them? Hold that memory for a while. It is going to matter. Now back to the Bellini estate, where the ground is about to shift again. New evidence began to appear in Marcella's hands. A photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of my mother in 1996, walking out of a restaurant on the east side of Cleveland with 2 men Marcella recognized as members of the rival Moretti family. A ledger entry, a hotel receipt, a record of a wire transfer whose account numbers no longer existed. Each item arrived through a different channel, each one from a source Tomas had spent decades cultivating. None of the sources ever knew about the others. That was Tomas's oldest trick. He never told the same lie twice, because a lie repeated is a lie remembered, and a lie remembered is a lie eventually traced. He told each of his people one clean, harmless-looking fact, and he let Marcella assemble the shape of the accusation herself. Marcella brought the file to Renzo. She trembled slightly as she set it on his desk. "Renzo," she said, "her mother met with the Morettis 3 weeks before the night in 1996. 3 weeks. I told you, I told you." Renzo turned the pages slowly. He did not look at me where I was standing near the window. His jaw set. His voice went flat. "Miss Hart," he said, "we will visit Teresa Moretti tomorrow, together, and we will see what your mother's old friends have to say." Teresa Moretti was 82, thin as a reed, and she received us in a small parlor filled with framed photographs of grandchildren. 2 of Renzo's men waited in the hallway. Renzo helped her from her chair himself when she rose to greet us, waving off a nurse who had moved to assist. I watched him steady the old woman's elbow, watched him wait, unhurried, while she found her footing. Something in my chest that had been fighting for a long time quietly gave up the fight. I had watched a man who was rumored to have killed rivals in his own kitchen offer his arm to an old woman with the patience of a grandson, and I knew that whatever I felt for Renzo Bellini now was not going to be undone by any report Marcella brought forward. Teresa sat us down. She poured tea herself, her hands steady despite her age. She looked at me for a long time. "You have your mother's mouth," she said finally. "Elaine had a mouth that told the truth even when it cost her." Then she turned to Renzo. "Renzo, sit. Listen. In 1996, 3 of us met in a room your father did not know about. Your mother, Lucia, Elaine Hart, and me. Your father was preparing a strike that would have killed a dozen of my sons and a dozen of your cousins. It would have finished both families. Lucia begged me to help her stop it. Elaine was the one who found the way. She was a nurse. She could move where our men could not. She entered that building the night before, sedated 2 guards without leaving a mark, and unlocked a service door for you to escape through. You were 23, Renzo. You walked past her in a corridor and you never knew her face. Renzo's hand tightened around the arm of his chair until the wood creaked. Teresa's voice softened. Elaine did not betray your family. She saved you. I could not speak. Renzo could not speak. Teresa poured more tea. But I will not tell you who killed your uncle that same week, she said. That is not my secret to give. It belongs to a man who is still alive. And I am too old to be the reason he is not. Teresa looked down at her cup. Your mother made me promise, Renzo. She said if the day ever came that you sat in my parlor with her daughter beside you, I was to tell you only what you needed to hear to stop hating a woman who loved you enough to unlock a door for you. The rest, she said, would find you if it was meant to. Elaine had a great faith in the way truth waits for the right room to speak in. We drove back to the estate in silence. Renzo did not touch my hand. He did not look at me. He stared out the window at the gray lake and, for a moment, I saw a boy of 23 walking past a woman in a corridor without ever knowing her face. When we arrived home, Renzo went into his study, closed the door, and did not come out until morning. I sat outside the study door for 2 of those hours, not because I believed he would open it, but because I wanted him to know, if he listened, that someone was on the other side of the wood. The third and final trap was constructed with surgical care. Marcella received, from a source she had come to trust absolutely, evidence that I had arranged a second private meeting with Teresa Moretti, one Renzo did not know about. There was a driver's log, a photograph, a hotel key. Marcella took the file to Renzo herself. She was crying by the time she set it down. Renzo, please, she whispered. Please. She is using her mother's ghost to walk into our family. Please listen. Renzo read the file. Then he walked out of his study, into the front hall, where I was speaking quietly to a member of the staff. He did not lower his voice. Half the household heard him. You will leave this house tonight, Miss Hart, he said, and his voice was the coldest I had ever heard it. You will not contact my sister. You will not contact any member of this family. You will not enter Cleveland again without my permission. The ring you carry is yours. Your mother's memory is your own. But whatever you thought you had built here is finished. I did not defend myself. I did not cry. I looked at him for a long moment, nodded once, and walked upstairs to pack. Marcella watched me go with a hand pressed to her mouth. She had wanted this for weeks. Now that it had come, she did not feel triumph. She felt cold, and the cold was worse than triumph would have been. To the staff, to the guards, to Marcella, to anyone watching from a distance patient enough to notice, the story was clear. Renzo Bellini had finally seen through the appraiser. The Elaine Hart matter was closed. I was to be driven quietly out of the city with my mother's ring wrapped in a scarf inside my satchel, sent home to Vermilion, and forgotten. Tomas Rinaldi heard the news in his own drawing room, over a glass of amber whiskey, and for the first time in 3 decades, a very small smile crossed his face. He had been waiting for this. He had waited through Renzo's father, through Renzo's mother, through Renzo's wife, through 9 years of Renzo's widowerhood. He had waited for a moment when Renzo would be angry enough, isolated enough, distracted enough. He picked up his telephone. He made 3 calls. In the first, he ordered a small team to intercept my car on the road out of Cleveland and take the ring from me before I could hand it to anyone else. In the second, he arranged for 2 of Renzo's most loyal senior guards to be reassigned to a supposed emergency on the west side of the city, leaving the estate thinner than it had been in 20 years. In the third, he summoned the captains he had spent decades quietly cultivating, men who owed their promotions to his whispered recommendations, and told them to be ready by midnight. He did not tell any of them the full plan. He never had. That was how he had lived to 76. The interception happened on a stretch of county road 12 miles from the estate. 2 vehicles boxed my sedan into a shoulder. Men in dark coats approached the driver's side with the calm of professionals who had done this many times. The lead man rapped once on my window. I rolled it down. My hands were steady on the wheel. I had spent the previous 2 nights practicing exactly this stillness in front of a mirror in the guest suite, because I had known that a single tremor in my voice would be enough for a professional to sense that something in the exchange was staged. He did not draw a weapon. He simply extended his gloved hand and said, "The ring, Miss Hart. Quietly, please." I reached into my coat pocket and handed him a small velvet pouch without a word. The man opened it, examined the contents by the light of his phone, and nodded to his partner. The ring inside was black onyx set in worn gold with a carved rim. It was, to any eye in the world except Gideon Voss's, absolutely identical to the one my mother had left me. It was not that ring. It was a duplicate Gideon had made in his back workshop over the previous 48 hours, from a hairline sketch I had drawn from memory. The real ring was in the interior pocket of a coat Teresa Moretti had put on that morning in her parlor, 80 miles away. I had never intended to leave the state, and the shoulder of that county road was, at that exact moment, ringed by 22 of Renzo Bellini's most loyal men, positioned in a wide, silent perimeter behind the tree line. Rifles came up. Radios clicked. The interceptors, who had believed themselves the hunters, understood in a single breath that they had been walked into a net. No one fired. No one had to. Back at the estate, Renzo was already in the sunroom when Tomas arrived, breathless, having heard the first fragmented radio reports, and realized that something in the operation had gone terribly wrong. Renzo was seated in a low chair, one hand resting on Mercer's gray head. He did not stand when Tomas entered. He gestured gently at the chair opposite him. "Sit down, Godfather," he said. His voice was quiet, almost warm. "We have a great deal to talk about." I was already there, standing just inside the door, and Tomas did not see me until he had sat down. Tomas sat. His face was composed, but a muscle worked once in his jaw. Renzo continued in the same soft tone. The men who intercepted Miss Hart's car on County Road 9 were told her route by 3 different captains. Each captain was given a different intersection. Only one intersection was correct. The men who arrived at the correct intersection can only have been given it by one of those 3 captains. That captain, along with everyone he has quietly promoted for the last 20 years, is currently being escorted to a barn outside the city. The 2 guards you reassigned to the west side of Cleveland this evening are, in fact, still on this property, in the East Wing, waiting for instructions from me. And the ring you have spent the last 30 years hunting was never in Miss Hart's coat. Tomas did not answer. Renzo leaned forward. His hand did not leave the dog's head. "You murdered my uncle after the women stopped my father's war. You told my father that Elaine Hart had betrayed us so that he would not look toward you. You spent 30 years feeding my sister just enough poison to keep her afraid of every woman who came near me. And when a woman finally walked into this house whose mother's ring might have unraveled you, you convinced my sister to test her, and you used those tests to measure how much I knew and how much I still needed to be lied to." Tomas's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Renzo waited, and the waiting was worse than any accusation. "You baptized me," Renzo said finally, softer than before. "I remember your hand on my forehead. I have carried that memory as if it were a gift. It was a receipt." Marcella was in the doorway. She had heard everything. She was holding the frame of the door with both hands to stay upright. I stepped past her, quietly, and stood beside Renzo's chair. I looked at Tomas Rinaldi with no anger and no triumph, only the steady attention I had once given to a Georgian pendant that did not belong on an inventory list. "The second test failed because I told Renzo about it," I said. "Everything after that we did together. The coldness, the public accusation, the car. All of it was so that you would move before you were ready. And you did." Tomas reached, almost gently, for the pistol inside his coat. He was old, but he had once been fast, and he still remembered how. Renzo saw the movement and stood between Tomas and me in a single motion. "Do not," Renzo said, "make me remember you as a man who tried to shoot a woman in my sunroom." Tomas's hand stopped. He looked at Renzo for a long time. Then his hand fell back to his side, and something in him that had been standing very straight for 30 years finally sat down. "Before we go into the last of it, tell me in the comments, if you had been Renzo in that sunroom, with the man who baptized him sitting 3 feet away, would you have been able to keep your voice as quiet as he did? I want to know." Now the story is not finished yet. Marcella crossed the room slowly. She stopped in front of me, and for the first time in weeks, she looked me fully in the face. "I was the door he came through," Marcella said. "I let him. I am so sorry." I did not smile. I did not embrace her. I said gently, "You were protecting your brother. He used the best part of you." It was not forgiveness. It was something older and more useful than forgiveness. It was recognition. Marcella swallowed once, nodded, and sat down on the arm of the nearest chair as if she had suddenly discovered how heavy her own body was. Tomas's captains were quietly separated from the men who had never truly been his that same night. Nobody died in Renzo's sunroom. Nobody died in the barn outside the city. The Bellini organization emerged from the operation smaller, cleaner, and for the first time since 1996, honest with itself. Tomas Rinaldi was taken away in a car whose destination Renzo did not share with me, and I did not ask. I understood, without needing to be told, that there were rooms in Renzo's life I would eventually be invited into, and rooms I would never enter. And I understood that a life with a man like him would always include that quiet threshold. I also understood, watching Renzo stand alone at the window after the car pulled away, that some decisions cost more than they show. The godfather had baptized him. The godfather had taught him to knot his first necktie. The godfather had lied to him at his mother's funeral and again at his wife's, and Renzo had believed both lies. And now Renzo had to fold that belief up like a napkin and set it aside forever. I did not touch him. I did not speak. I simply stood beside him at the window, close enough that our sleeves brushed. And after a long while, Renzo let out a breath he had been holding. I realized, since the sentence about my mother's ring had first walked into his study on the morning we met. 3 mornings later, I stood in Gideon Voss's back workshop while the old jeweler bent over my mother's ring with a loop he had used for 60 years. Renzo stood beside me. Marcella waited in the doorway, still pale, still learning how to stand in a house whose history had just been rewritten. Gideon straightened slowly. His eyes found Renzo's first, and then mine. "I told you the number was wrong," he said. "I made 4 rings in 1996, not 3. Renzo's face did not move, but his hand found mine and held it. Gideon reached into a battered leather portfolio and pulled out an old photograph, curled at the edges, faded to sepia at the corners. 4 people stood in front of Gideon's original shop: Lucia Bellini, Teresa Moretti, Elaine Hart, and a 4th figure, a man in his early 30s with a quiet, careful face, holding a ring in his open palm. My breath left my body. My free hand rose slowly, fingertips finding the glass over the photograph. "That's my father," I whispered. "That is Martin Reeve. My mother told me he disappeared before I was born." Renzo looked at Gideon. Gideon nodded very slowly. "The 4th ring," he said, "has a different mark inside the rim. I have never known what it means. Only the man who wore it did. And he came for it once, 30 years ago, and asked me not to tell your mother he had been here. Then he walked out of my shop, and I have not seen him since. Your mother came to see me a month later. She had heard somehow that a man had come. She did not ask his name. She only asked me to promise her that if her daughter ever stood in this workshop, I would tell her the truth, but only the part of the truth that would not send her looking for him. I have kept the first half of that promise, Miss Hart. I do not know how to keep the second." Renzo turned me gently toward him. He did not offer me a job. He did not offer me protection. He did not, in that moment, even offer me a future. He simply said, "Stay in Cleveland, not because I need you to, because I want you here." I looked up at him, and for the first time since I had walked through the iron gates of his estate, I allowed myself the truth I had been holding at arm's length for weeks. "I will stay," I said, "but not until I know what my father was doing in that photograph, and not until I know who else might still be looking for the 4th ring." Renzo nodded once. Mercer, curled against the leg of the workbench, lifted his gray head and sighed. And for a moment the room smelled of old metal and lemon polish, and the faint, clean scent of a lake wind coming in through the workshop's open window. Outside, Cleveland was going on with its afternoon, unaware that a 30-year lie had finally been buried, and that a much older and stranger question had just been dug up in its place. Somewhere, I thought, a man who might be my father had spent 30 years being deliberately absent, and I was going to have to decide whether an absent father was a mercy I wanted to leave alone, or a door I was ready to open. If this story moved you, if it made you lean forward even once, please leave it a like and subscribe. Part 2 is already being written, and I promise you, the fourth ring is going to open a door none of us are ready for. Tell me in the comments who you think Martin Reeve really was, and what he was hiding from his own daughter. I read every one, and the best guess I have seen so far is closer than you might think. Until then, take care of the people whose secrets you have not yet asked about. Some of us saved someone's life once, in a corridor, and never told a soul. And we are counting on you to be gentle when the ring finally shows up in your hand.